So one of the things that we're learning more and more about the brain is that you don't activate just one part of the brain. You activate networks of the brain. And when it comes to attention, you can think of sort of two main attentional networks in the brain. One of them is called, you could refer to as sort of the top-down attention network. So this is the attentional network you need when you decide that you need to focus on something and you need to give your concentration to that. And it's a really important network to have because you want to be able to focus and get things done. And a lot of video games don't really tap into that network as much as the other network. The other network is sort of a bottom-up network. And that is more activated by the deeper structures of your brain. And that is the part of your brain that alerts you to something that may be happening around. So video games are really, really good at using, some would even say, hijacking the bottom-up network. Because they're all about sort of, and smartphones do this too, right? They're all about, all of a sudden trying to grab your attention. There's a shooter over here, there's a shooter over there, and you have to constantly shift your attention. Getting that network developed can sometimes come at the expense of the other one. So that is where sometimes there is a little bit of concern that lots and lots of video games, especially video games that are very much about shifting your attention somewhere else and not about really focusing in on one place, may kind of skew the balance a little bit. Well, for one thing that comes up about video games is sort of arousal level. So video games are great because there's lots of sounds and there's alerts and there's colors and there's lots of things, and that activates your brain. That's what it was designed to do, is to sort of hold your attention. And if you're immersed in that kind of an environment for hour after hour after hour, your arousal threshold, the amount of stimulation your brain needs to get focused, might go up. So imagine a kid who's been playing Halo for hours and hours and hours, and then they go into a classroom where there's much less stimulation. There's a teacher at a blackboard talking, trying to get kids to look at a boring book. And it can be a challenge for kids to sort of be able to focus at that lower level of stimulation. However, you can design video games, and people have designed video games to actually try to develop and get kids to practice that top-down network. Different video games probably can have, slightly different effects. For a lot of people, video games are very pleasurable, right? And, when people do things that they really find rewarding, it activates another system in your brain, areas like the nucleus accumbens. It activates a neurotransmitter called dopamine that you've probably heard about. And this is a neurotransmitter that does a lot of really important brain functions, but it also can underlie various kinds of dependencies and addictions. And so things or substances that tend to be addictive tend to be really good at rapidly raising dopamine levels in the brain, or rapidly activating dopamine areas of the brain. And it turns out that, some video games can do this,
An addiction.
But, certainly I would think that as video games become more social through technology, that does sort of reveal a different part of things and may add for a more social component to it than has existed before, when it was generally just one person in a room or two people on a couch. Yeah, I think there's some evidence that that video games are not necessarily going to turn some sweet little kid into a serial killer, and and actually the link between video games and actual things like mass shootings, I mean, that level of violence, I think is not particularly strong. I don't think we can point at video games as the main culprit driving, actual school violence. But there is evidence that that video games can sort of prime aggression, and kids who already may be prone to being a little aggressive may be the ones who are the most susceptible to it. There was a striking study that was done, a really good study that was done a couple years ago, where they divided a group of young kids, and half of them watched a relatively violent movie, nothing too horrible, and another one watched like a neutral nature show. And then the kids went out in a group sort of play. They went out for recess, basically, and they could play with a lot of things. And one of the things that they could play with was a disabled handgun. And it turned out that the kids who had watched the more violent movie were much more likely to actually pull the trigger of a real disabled gun than the kids who watched a neutral movie, including one kid who actually walked up to a little girl and pointed the gun and aimed it at her head and pulled the trigger. We know that imitation is one of the most powerful forms of learning. Many video games are also, incredibly demeaning towards women. If you've ever looked at games like Grand Theft Auto, I mean, the role that women play in that game, and people are taking on those characters and treating people that way. I mean, these are the kind of things I think that give some people concern. Not that video games are the root of all evil, but that they have a potential to do harm. Again, video games are probably not the primary driver of why kids have attentional problems, and one of the thorny issues in the research has been a chicken or the egg problem, because it turns out that if you are genetically predisposed to have attention problems, you probably are especially drawn to all the bells and whistles and lights and action and stimulation that are in video games. So is it the ADHD that's causing the video games, or the video games causing the ADHD? And there's probably a little bit of back and forth and bidirectional influences. I mean, there's some evidence that video games can have some positive effects on sort of fine motor coordination, being able, and like I talked about, this bottom-up attentional network, being able to sort of rapidly shift your attention to somewhere else. One finding that's coming up, not only just for video games, but these kinds of things that you can do online, like the luminosity, where people sort of say you can train your brain for good things. It turns out that that the skills that you generate from one video game often don't really generalize as much as you would think. So that if you get really good at doing this particular kind of puzzle, online puzzle, you get better at doing that particular online puzzle, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a general improvement in some kind of more global cognitive skill. That it's, these online relationships are replacing the more sort of in-person relationships. And while there can be a lot of value in online relationships, if that becomes sort of all somebody has, then I think a lot of us would think that there's been something lost there. You can't just replace, for most people, all of their real-world interactions with texts and online posts.
Can children learn from video games?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think parents should be aware that a lot of what are marketed as educational games don't really have the science behind it. And for other screens too. I mean, this may be a little before your time, but there used to be the whole kind of baby Einstein craze where people were, putting their infants in front of, for long periods of time, in front of these videos that played classical music and had good shapes. And it really drew their attention, but there were claims that this was actually, making kids smarter, hence the name. And, but I mean, I think screens and computers and video, interactive sort of things have the potential to teach, and we should, take advantage of that.